Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Thank you for tuning in to the CBSN special, Crisis in the Middle East, Fears of War. Tensions in the Persian Gulf have now reached a boiling point between the United States and Iran. The latest escalation, Iran's strike on two bases in Iraq, where U.S. troops are stationed as revenge for the targeted killing of its top commander. President Trump has since announced new sanctions on Iran as punishment. But an end to the conflict doesn't yet seem to be in sight. Two questions currently surround the state of play in the Persian Gulf. How did we get here, and what comes next? Here's what's happened within the past 2 weeks. On December 27th, an attack on a military base near the Iraqi city of Kirkuk killed an American contractor and left several others wounded. The attack was carried out by a sect of Hezbollah with ties to Iran. The group, however, has denied responsibility. On December 29th, President Trump ordered airstrikes in sections of Iraq and Syria where some of the militia was reportedly located. The announcement was made by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley. On December 31st, supporters of the militia group stormed the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. President Trump condemned the violence and later threatened Iran, saying it would be fully responsible for lives lost. On January 2nd, President Trump ordered a drone strike on Baghdad International Airport that resulted in the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. Iran and the world immediately reacted to the death of Soleimani. While Iran vowed revenge, President Trump defended his order.
What the United States did yesterday should have been done long ago. A lot of lives would have been saved. Just recently, Soleimani led the brutal repression of protesters in Iran, where more than 1,000 innocent civilians were tortured and killed by their own government. We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war.
Earlier this week, on Monday, a sea of mourners took to Tehran to attend Soleimani's funeral. The slain general's successor publicly vowed to avenge his death. Meanwhile, 3,000 additional U.S. troops were deployed to the Middle East. On Tuesday, Iranian officials promised retaliation was on its way, while Defense Secretary Mark Esper defended President Trump's strike. He said while the U.S. is not seeking a war with Iran, it's ready to finish one. And late Wednesday night, Iran kept its promise of retaliation. Tehran launched missile strikes on two bases in Iraq where U.S. troops are stationed, the Al-Assad Air Base and the Erbil Air Base. Both are more than 100 miles from the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. Video from state TV shows the Iranian military launching the missiles on the two bases. There were no American or Iraqi casualties in the attack. A defense official tells CBS News the U.S. had, quote, multiple hours of warning prior to the attack, giving troops plenty of time to take shelter in bunkers. On Twitter, Iran's foreign minister called the strike proportionate measures. He also said, quote, we do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression. President Trump responded to the retaliation Wednesday morning. He announced new sanctions on Tehran and slammed the Iran nuclear deal.
Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979, to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq.
Let's bring in Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, David Martin, and Zeke Miller. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Catherine is CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent. David is CBS News National Security Correspondent. And Zeke is an Associated Press White House reporter and CBSN political contributor. Welcome to all of you. Major, I want to begin with you. President Trump made a claim that the Iranian missiles fired on Tuesday night were paid for by the funds made available by the Obama administration. What exactly is the president referencing, and is there any truth to his claims?
There is no direct truth to it at all. It's utterly unprovable. It's reckless. It adds to a deepening partisan split over this maneuver by the Trump administration against the Iranian regime. But let's just step back for a couple of minutes from the assertions the president made, why they are unproven, unprovable, and deeply reckless. And I urge those watching, if you really want to do a deep dive on this, go to the Washington Post, go to the fact checkers on this. I'll only summarize what is easily summarizable about this particular topic, but there's much more to learn if you are curious. The president said $150 billion. That figure is false. He said we gave the money away. The money was not ours. The money belonged to Iran. In what form? Frozen bank accounts. Why were the bank accounts frozen? Because of international sanctions. What did those international sanctions accomplish? It brought Iran to the table to negotiate what? The Iran nuclear deal. When that nuclear deal was consummated, meaning put together and agreed upon, those frozen bank accounts were unfrozen. Okay? That's what happened. And it wasn't $150 billion. The Treasury Department, the Trump Treasury Department estimate is about 55 to 60 billion. So there's a big fact error there. The Iranians say it's much less. The president also mentioned $1.8 billion. It wasn't that much. It was about $1.6 billion. And it was part of a long settled dispute between Iran and the United States for arms purchases Iran made when? Well before 1979, when the Iranian revolutionary regime seized the U.S. embassy, took American hostages, and diplomatic relations ended. That money was handed over to Iran, much of it in cash. You could disagree with that various policy decision by the Obama administration to give that money, which belonged to Iran, had been settled by International Criminal Court, to Iran. If you disagree with that, fine. But don't suggest that that money itself was illicitly given to Iran, or suggest or imply, as the president has previously, that it was taxpayer money. It never was, never will be, never could be. And no one knows what that cash did. Now, is it worth noting that cash in the Iranian regime can go to terrorist proxies? Of course it can. And John Kerry, the former Secretary of State in the Obama administration, admitted after the Iran nuclear deal was put together that possibly and probably some of it did. But to say it paid for these missiles on this particular strike, that is a leap of not only unprovable facts, it's an assertion meant to place blame that can't be ascribed to the Obama administration at a time when the nation is trying to understand and come to grips with essential facts.
David, I want to turn to you. What more do we know about the types and the number of missiles that were used and those hours leading up to the attack? Were American officials able to detect movement? How far in advance?
They were. I remember being told on Sunday that the alert level of the Iranian ballistic missile force was being raised, and at that time I was told that they were within 24 hours of being able to launch. It turned out that they didn't make the decision for a little longer than that, but the U.S. Military, U.S. intelligence devotes a lot of time, energy, and money into collecting signals, intelligence on Iran. And when you start raising the alert level of your missile force, there are just some certain communications that you have to make. There are signals that start getting transmitted, and these get picked up. And if you can't actually intercept the communication and read it, you can just tell by the volume of the communications that something is up. So they had what they claim is a very good warning, and I don't doubt it. This is a game that U.S. intelligence has been playing ever since the old Soviet Union got their first intercontinental ballistic missile, keeping track of missiles around the world. And there is, in the United States government, every time a missile goes off anywhere in the world, it is detected by an infrared satellite that's 22,000 miles up in space, and immediately a conference call is convened of government officials to determine whether or not that missile is a threat to the United States. Usually the call is over in less than a minute because it's the initial trajectory shows it's not a threat to the United States. But this is a system that has been built up over years and years and years. And in this case, as the president said, the early warning system worked. And I should point out, it's a good thing the early warning system worked, because the U.S. had no defenses against ballistic missiles in Iraq. Those defenses usually consist of Patriot air defense missiles, and there are no Patriot air defense missiles in Iraq because the U.S. troops are there to fight a force, namely ISIS, which doesn't have ballistic missiles, so it was not prepared to defend against a ballistic missile attack from Iran.
Well, Zeke, the president spoke with NATO's Secretary General about this situation. What came out of that conversation?
Well, we heard a little bit of that from the president during his remarks earlier today, where he discussed the possibility of NATO playing a larger role in Middle East peace and security efforts. It's worth noting that NATO played a role as part of the international coalition against the Islamic State. But this is something we've heard from the president time and again. He's complained that he believes that Cold War era alliance is obsolete and that needs to be modernized to adapt to today's threats. So that was the substance of the president's phone call with the Secretary General of NATO, and then also some of his public remarks. That said, it's worth noting that NATO's current mission on the ground, which has been to train Iraqi partners to fight against the Islamic State, that mission has been suspended over the last several days, like the U.S. mission, due to the exact same thing because of force protection concerns. So in the short term, NATO, like the U.S., like U.S. forces in the region, are not really engaging in their primary mission. They're in more of a defensive posture. And then longer term, any effort to get NATO to play a larger role in the region would require consensus among the president and the rest of the alliance. And as we saw from the last meeting that was held in London in December of the alliance, there are some deep divisions over the nature of the alliance, its priorities, and also, of course, how much everyone should be paying for it. And that's been a particular issue we've heard the president time and again harp on.
Right. We've certainly heard him say that time and time again. Catherine, members of the House and Senate have now been briefed on the strike that killed a top Iranian general last week, and not everyone appears to be satisfied. What more, Catherine, do we know about this?
Well, it's a very mixed assessment from the lawmakers who were in that classified briefing, Elaine. Let's start with Republican Senator Mike Lee. He told reporters at the stakeout on Capitol Hill that he is a supporter of the president, that President Trump, he said, had shown tremendous restraint, but he thought that this was the worst military briefing that he'd had in almost a decade. He said they were told that any kind of challenge to future actions or response from the United States would be, in effect, emboldening Iran. Now, if you look at a Democratic response from Senator Tim Kaine, he said he saw no intelligence that satisfied him that there was an imminent threat that justified the strike against General Soleimani. But then Republican Tom Cotton said that it was clear to him that the strike had been highly successful. He said the response by the Iranians last night was feckless and weak. And he also indicated that Iran had not only de-escalated because the decisions taken by the Trump White House, but he said it had in effect taken a U-turn, and that Iran finally understood, in the face of further military pressure by the United States, that they would be held responsible for actions by additional parties, so their proxies and their militias.
Right. So, Catherine, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security sent law enforcement a warning highlighting the terror threats Iran poses. What more can you tell us about this bulletin?
Well, this bulletin went out from Homeland Security and the FBI. It did not speak to any specific or credible evidence of a retaliatory strike by Iran targeting U.S. interests, but it laid out what is seen as the most likely response from Iran if they proceed. And that's kind of a 1-2 punch. First, an attack, which is a physical attack like what we saw in Iraq last night, followed then by a cyber attack. It's kind of like a 1-2 punch. And the cyber piece is important because it sows confusion, and Iran's past pattern has been to attack financial institutions as well. And because attribution in cyberspace is so difficult, it can be hard for the U.S. to pinpoint on Tehran. And just to emphasize what I've been saying for a couple of days here, when you look at the cyber DNA, what you see is that Iran is very similar to Russia because they have historically relied on Moscow for technology as well as training.
Major, we know all of this, of course, is happening against the backdrop of the election in November. Is there any way to know whether the actions the president has taken, namely to pull back a bit, as we've seen here in the last day, a decision based on that kind of political climate, domestically speaking, or is this something that as commander-in-chief, an action he decided to take anyway as commander-in-chief?
Well, every action of a commander-in-chief, and especially one of this magnitude and probably long-running consequences, is going to be evaluated in a political context. That evaluation doesn't mean it was decided on a political basis. It just means there will be political reaction to it. And I do think it's worth taking the administration at its word that there had been several instances of Iranian provocation that did not elicit a kinetic military response from the United States all through the months leading up to, as you started this show, the December 27th rocket attack that led to the death of one American contractor and the injury of several others, plus the attempted movement toward the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Those were things that brought this to a new level and a new level of seriousness. There is this ongoing debate about the quality of this intelligence that suggested another attack was coming. How lethal was it going to be? How imminent? Lawmakers are disagreeing about it, but there was something there that got the U.S. attention. All of those things taken together in any time, whether there's an impeachment trial looming, as there is, a re-election campaign looming, as there is, would attract the attention of an American president and at least create a very serious internal debate about what to do. This president decided to do what many regarded in his national security team as one of the, if not the most maximalist reaction. Take out Qasem Soleimani and send Iran an unmistakable message that the United States had reached its limit, and this was now going to be viewed through a completely different lens, and Iran better do that as well. I wouldn't say the president has taken any particular off-ramp right now. Both sides have done what they have done for the time being. But to Catherine's previous point, I don't think there's anyone in the U.S. intelligence or national security community who believes this is over. It may be paused for a period of time. Iran may be waiting, either in cyberspace or elsewhere. or through its proxies to do other things. But for now, I wouldn't say the president is pulling back or being necessarily diplomatic. It just is at a place where both sides regard it as a status quo that is livable for the moment. But I don't think the situation is anywhere close to being over.
All right, Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, David Martin, Zeke Miller, please stand by. Ahead on CBSN, an extended cut of Norah O'Donnell's interview with Vice President Mike Pence. It's his first network TV interview since the killing of Qasem Soleimani. His take on the tensions with Iran next. You're streaming the CBSN special, Crisis in the Middle East, Fears of War. In an exclusive interview, CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell spoke with Vice President Mike Pence about the death of General Qasem Soleimani and the retaliation from Tehran that followed. Here is that conversation.
Joining us now for his first interview since the attack, Vice President Mike Pence. Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Iran's supreme leader called the attack a slap in the face. But are you worried a punch in the gut may be around the corner?
Well, I think the American people can rest easier tonight, thanks to the leadership that President Donald Trump provided and the extraordinary and courageous professionalism that our military demonstrated over the last several weeks. Despite missile attacks yesterday, again, because of the professionalism of our military personnel and their preparedness, there were no American casualties, no Iraqi casualties, and our information as of this afternoon continues to be that Iran is standing down.
I heard that, and the president saying that Iran is standing down. But how concerned are you that Iran is now going to begin a covert war?
Well, we're dealing with a country that's been the leading state sponsor of terrorism for more than 20 years. And so we'll continue to be prepared. We'll continue to confront Iran in the way that President Trump has done since early in this administration.
So what is the strategy in Iran? And is regime change the ultimate strategy?
We don't seek regime change in Iran, but we want to see the regime change its behavior.
You were there in the Situation Room last night with the president and other top national security officials. Thankfully, no American lives lost. Did we get lucky, or did the Iranians intentionally miss?
Well, let me say that the fact that no American lives were lost was a great relief, I know, to the president, to myself, to our entire national security team, as it is to every American.
Were we warned in advance?
We had received intelligence over the previous several days that there may be attacks coming. We heard the threats. The world heard the threats from Iran. We moved forces. We provided the level of force protection at the president's direction. And in a very real sense, we had the early warning systems that allowed us to move Americans and our allies out of harm's way. But look, the American people deserve to know, while the missile fired at the Erbil base landed off base, the missiles that struck al-Assad struck the al-Assad air base and it clearly threatened American lives. And we are grateful there were no lives lost, but all the credit goes to our military and to their preparedness for this event.
I think the question that many Americans would want me to ask is, does the threat still exist from Iran? And let's take a look at the map, because we have about 60,000 U.S. troops throughout the region in the Middle East. And of course, Iran is smack dab in the middle. And this morning, President Rouhani said, our final answer to Soleimani's assassination will be to kick all U.S. forces out of the region. Would the U.S. consider a drawdown of U.S. forces?
Well, from very early in his campaign for president and through this administration, President Trump has made it clear that we don't want American forces deployed anywhere in the world other than what's absolutely necessary. But we recognize the strategic importance of the forces that are deployed today in Iraq, and frankly, all across the region. And when you look at the long career of Qasem Soleimani, all of his terrorist violence, where it cost more than 600 American service members' lives, wounded thousands of more, hundreds of thousands of deaths in Syria, all of it was designed to use terrorist violence to drive America from the region. And what our allies in the region should understand is we're going to continue to stand strong against Iranian aggression. We're going to continue to stand strong with nations around the world, demand that they abandon terrorist violence, they abandon their nuclear ambition, and we create a more peaceful and prosperous future for all the nations in the region.
Everybody who's related to one of those soldiers stationed in the Middle East is worried. Are we safer now?
I believe we are safer today than before President Trump ordered our military to take out Qasem Soleimani. This was a man who had been leading a terrorist state-sponsored organization in the region, sowing violence, and his elimination from the battlefield, and also the president's demonstration of not only the ability to use military power, which the world knows we have. We have the strongest military in the history of the world. But what President Trump, our commander-in-chief, demonstrated was we have a president who's also willing to use American military might to protect American lives. We lost one American life on December 27th, and the president ordered military strikes on those Iranian-sponsored militia bases. He moved troops into our embassy in Baghdad to protect American lives, and he ordered us to take out Qasem Soleimani to save American lives from an imminent attack that was being prepared.
One might say that taking out Soleimani is like taking a baseball bat to a hornet's nest. And those hornets are Iranian proxy groups. Are you convinced that they won't come after Americans?
Well, the challenge that we face now is that Qasem Soleimani was, in fact, the primary leader of those Iranian-sponsored militias across northern Iran and their influence in Syria as well. But we're sending a very clear message, as we did with those 5 airstrikes to militia bases.
He didn't act alone, as you know.
And we'll not tolerate violence.
And he acted at the blessing, and with the blessing, I should say, of the Ayatollah, the supreme leader.
There's no question. And frankly, we're receiving some encouraging intelligence that Iran is sending messages to those very same militias not to move against American targets or civilians. And we hope that that message continues to echo.
Let me ask you, because something else happened last night. This Ukrainian International Airlines flight went down. Is there any evidence or intelligence to suggest that Iranians may have taken down this plane?
We don't have any information to support the cause. Our hearts grieve for all of the innocent lives that were lost in that air crash.
Let me ask you, let me just turn to the Senate trial. The former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who you worked with, said he is willing to testify. Are you concerned that he's turning against the president?
Well, I have no concerns about John Bolton or the facts of the case, but it really is remarkable, Nora, that after they rushed this partisan impeachment forward, this sham investigation, where the administration was not allowed to have counsel, not allowed to call witnesses, now they're demanding that the Senate bring additional witnesses and bring additional evidence. And I think the American people see through this. I think they see through this.
But you're not worried about John Bolton
partisan effort? Not in the least. What I can tell you is that the American people can read the transcript. They can see there was no quid pro quo. The president did nothing wrong. And all along the way, President Trump and my focus in this effort was to see to it that we enlisted more European support for Ukraine, and that we saw President Zelensky and the Ukrainian legislature actually take steps to end years of corruption that have beset that country. Those were the priorities. When the president was satisfied that those issues had been addressed, he released the aid, and those are the facts.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nora.
Let's bring back our panel. Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, David Martin, and Zeke Miller. Major, let me begin with you. Just your initial thoughts on the vice president's response to Tuesday's attack. What stood out to you?
Well, that the administration is trying to make a case that the Iranian threat was ongoing and real. It is saying less and less about the immediacy of it. And in today's briefings on Capitol Hill, that was a point of contention. How immediate, how threatening, how lethal was this threat? Or was it part of a long-standing, generalized threat that Qasem Soleimani exercised with great authority and almost unchecked movability throughout the region for many, many years? I mean, the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, has said more than once in the last couple of days his day was due. Well, does that just mean that the United States and the Trump administration finally had enough and said, you're out and we're going to use you as the means by which to send this unmistakable message to Iran? Fine, make that case. And then live with all the consequences. But this idea that there was something so immediate, so lethal, so terrible, that evidence has not been presented to Congress, even in a classified setting. And so there is this emerging, what I would say, rationale for the administration that Iran is a bad actor, a malevolent actor in the region. True. No question about that. And that it's going to continue its maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions and now this military action to try to redirect Iranian behavior. But it is also worth noting that in the last year, Iran's behavior has become more malign, not less. And you have to ask yourself, to what degree is that being driven by Iranian reaction to the maximum pressure campaign?
Well, David, the vice president told Nora that the U.S. has intelligence that Iran has asked its allied militias not to attack U.S. targets. What does that tell us about what could happen next year, potentially?
Well, in the first place, at almost exactly the same time that Vice President Pence was making that remark to Nora, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, was standing right across the hall from where I'm sitting, saying that we expect additional attacks from Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and elsewhere against American positions. So you got two different interpretations there of what the intelligence is saying. To me, it seems most likely that what's going to happen here is we're going to go back to this lower grade fever that had been afflicting relations between the U.S. and Iran for months and months and months, which is these attacks by Iranian-backed groups on American positions, maybe not deadly attacks, but just harassment attacks, a rocket here, a rocket there, and that's great as long as something bad doesn't happen and one of those rockets, which are not the most precise weapons in the world, goes astray and lands on a barracks full of Americans. The killing of that one U.S. contractor, who, by the way, turned out to be a naturalized citizen of Iraqi descent, that set off this series of events which led to this crisis, which, you know, for a while there looked like it was going to take us over the brink. And I think it's noteworthy in both the president's remarks and in Vice President Pence's interview with Nora, he doesn't say Iran is backing down. All he's saying is Iran is standing down. And all that means is Iran is taking its forces off alert. Iran is no longer preparing for an attack against United States interests with its military, with the military based in Iran, which has a return address. If we get hit by them, we know where it came from. But I think I just can't imagine Iran giving up its covert campaign to drive the U.S. out of the Middle East. My first day on the job at CBS was in April of 1983, the day Hezbollah, which was the Iranian surrogate in Lebanon, blew up the American embassy with a suicide truck bomber. And 6 months later, a suicide truck bomber drove into a Marine barracks in Beirut and killed 242 Americans, in which until 9/11 was the worst terrorist attack. And it worked because the U.S. pulled its troops out of Lebanon. So this campaign began a long time ago, and I don't think they're about to abandon it anytime soon.
Right. It's so important to remember the context of all that happened well before what we've seen take place here just in the last month or so. Catherine, let me turn to you. The vice president said that the United States forces acted on killing General Soleimani based on intelligence. What is the latest that we actually know about the depth of intelligence behind all of this?
Well, based on my reporting starting last week, a senior U.S. government official told CBS News that they had been tracking General Soleimani for a number of days and that he was personally involved overseeing a plot targeting U.S. interests in the region. And it was described to us at that time as an imminent and an active plot. What I think is key in Nora's interview with the vice president is that he has said on the record that he believes Americans are safer as a result of the targeted strike on General Soleimani. So voters can make that assessment heading into November, whether that is in fact the case. I think it's important to emphasize to folks at home that General Soleimani was special within the regime. He wore multiple hats. He was like the CIA director. He was like the special operations commander. And he was also sort of functioning in part as a Secretary of State. So to lose someone at that level of importance within a regime can be paralyzing. And that's what the intelligence is suggesting, at least in the short term. But we don't know what the medium term or the longer term picture will be for the Iranians. And to David's point, it does appear by all accounts that they are taking a pause, at least for now.
Well, Zeke, the vice president said that America's maximum pressure campaign is all about bringing to an end what he calls decades of support for terrorism. So how has that pressure campaign evolved under President Trump?
Well, it really began pretty much from the first days of the president's time in office. He began directing his administration officials to begin preparing for withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal, and looking for new ways to impose sanctions on Iran. That stemmed from the president's complaint that the nuclear deal, and from critics of that deal at the time as well, that the nuclear deal did not do enough to curtail Iran's regional and sort of malevolence and also support for terrorist groups, as well as its ballistic missile program. There's evidence that the missiles used in this strike are of an older generation than some of its newer models. That was what came out of the Pentagon briefing today. But more broadly, that because the Obama administration negotiated a deal that solely focused on Iran's nuclear program and ignored the other things, they wanted to go sort of rip up that deal and reopen and try to force Iran back to the negotiating table to craft a new deal that dealt with all of its problems. The reason why the Obama administration, of course, didn't do that 6 or 7 years ago was that they believed that there's no way Iran would do that. And there's still very little indication that Iran would do that, despite this 2.5-year campaign of crushing economic and political sanctions on Iran that have at some points brought that economy on the brink of what seemed at points like collapse. Or certainly it sparked widespread protests in Iran last year as well about the economic situation there. So there are signs that that maximum pressure is being felt by Iran, but there's yet to be any evidence really of a change in behavior on the part of the Iranian government and its leadership, and that's the real challenge. I mean, tactically what the Trump administration is doing has been successful. That is imposing crushing sanctions on the Iranian government, but strategically, in terms of getting the outcome at once, that is yet to be in evidence, and there really has been no assessment from anyone across the U.S. government that anything that we have seen so far is going to change that just yet.
Major, before we go, the first thing the president said during his speech on Wednesday was that he would never let Iran get a nuclear weapon. Based on what we know about how far along Iran's nuclear program is, Is it clear whether or not the president will have to go far, how far he will have to go, rather, to keep that promise?
Well, this is a very good point to make as we sort of try to wrap up or contextualize this conversation, Elaine, because this is the next great challenge. So Iran has been stepping away from its obligations under the Iran nuclear deal and suggesting very recently that it's going to start using centrifuges again, start making nuclear material, which could bring it closer to obtaining a nuclear weapon. Because the United States has pulled out of the nuclear agreement, Iran didn't feel bound by that, was sort of staying with it a little bit, but the death of Qasem Soleimani has certainly incentivized, from the Iranian point of view, not dealing with America on this basis. And if, in fact, Iran does visibly accelerate its pursuit of the means and material necessary to build a nuclear weapon, the president's vow, which he stated before he even began his prepared remarks this morning, will be tested. Why is this so important? Because there's lots, and David, I will defer to him on this, but I know there is Pentagon analysis of how difficult it would be to take out or to degrade the nuclear facilities Iran built. Did it build it in secret? Did it build it in contravention of its public commitments to live up to international law? Yes, that's all true. So was it doing it off the books and against international law? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean it's not difficult to take out. And if, in fact, the president, and he used the attack on Qasem Soleimani to tell the Iranians, I'm serious. When you hear my words, you better believe them. If Iran does move in the direction to accelerate pursuit of the means by which to create a nuclear weapon, then this is going to come to a head. And it could come to a head in a matter of months. And that's in addition to all the other things we've talked about. Iranian proxies, waiting, cyber attacks, other things in the region or in parts of Europe or maybe even here in the United States. As revenge for this, the nuclear question, I think, looms the largest.
Right. Profoundly high stakes here. Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, David Martin, Zeke Miller, thank you all very much. Still to come, the killing of Iran's top commander has nearly led to war with the United States. We'll take a look at what Qasem Soleimani's death means for the Gulf region. This is the CBSN special, Crisis in the Middle East, Fears of War. We'll be right back. After days of back and forth threats and warnings, the latest tensions between the United States and Iran lead back to the death of General Qasem Soleimani. He was the head of Iran's elite Quds force and was blamed for the deaths of hundreds of American troops. Holly Williams has more on the significance of Soleimani's death.
The loss of Qasem Soleimani is a heavy blow to Iran. He was a war hero, the commander of Iran's feared Quds force, responsible for secretive foreign operations. He wasn't well known in the United States, but he was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East, sometimes even touted as a possible future leader of Iran. For America, though, General Soleimani was a problem. In April last year, the US designated the Quds Force a foreign terrorist organization.
We are sending a clear signal, a clear message to Iran's leaders, including Qasem Soleimani and his band of thugs, that the United States is bringing all pressure to bear to stop the regime's outlaw behavior.
The Pentagon says Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American and coalition service members and also approved the attack on the US embassy in Baghdad this week. But even many of Soleimani's enemies admitted he was a military genius. He spearheaded Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war, helping to shore up the Syrian regime's grip on power. And in Iraq, ironically, he and his forces were on the same side as the US, fighting against ISIS.
Behnam Ben Taleblu is in our Washington bureau. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thanks for joining us. Given what you heard from the president, do you believe the U.S. response to this latest incident was a measured one?
Well, great to be back with you. I think the U.S. response, especially given what we now are beginning to find out about the Iranian response, the ballistic missile strikes against two military facilities in Iraq where the U.S. and Iraqi forces are co-located, was measured. It was very prudent, and it offered Iran a de-escalation path, an off-ramp. And I think all eyes are going to be on Iran if they take it.
Well, the president announced that the U.S. will impose more sanctions on Tehran. But if the president offered some sort of an olive branch to Iran, would he be perceived as politically weak?
You know, I think that's one thing that we should disaggregate here. Offering Iran an off-ramp from military escalation should not be confused with offering Iran premature sanctions relief, which is actually the goal of Iran's larger escalation policy. It's worth remembering for the viewers that starting in May of 2019, which is the one-year anniversary of the U.S. leaving the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA deal, what Trump calls the Obama nuclear deal, the Iranians started to escalate their nuclear program, their activities in the region, in the Persian Gulf, and everything that the U.S. is worried about much further, so as to get America to end prematurely its sanction strategy. So if the U.S. offers Iran this premature economic and financial relief, that would give the regime a lease on life, and I could absolutely see the president perhaps getting attacked from both sides of the aisle on that. But if the Americans actually de-escalate, I think that's responsible statecraft.
Behnam, as someone who is familiar with Iran and this regime and how it operates, in your view, have we seen the end of these latest rounds of provocations?
You know, my short answer is no, but there's a no but. You know, the Iranian responses to the death of Qasem Soleimani may feature a response in other theaters, meaning the Iranians responded overtly and publicly with a high-risk military move that had a strong political signal in neighboring Iraq. But there may be more, and it may take time for the Iranians to want to plan other attacks, materialize other attacks, and decide if America's red line really will remain red over time. And even if it is the end, and I am wrong, then there will still be competition between America and Iran, because still the Iranian activities in the region are driven by both local conditions as well as a desire to turn around and upend those sanctions and get that premature sanctions relief we had been talking about.
Well, how have America's international allies responded to this? What are their strategic interests in the region?
Well, it had still been evolving. We know today that President Trump mentioned something about NATO having a greater presence in the region. We don't know if this would be, of course, a replacement to U.S. forces or a complement to U.S. forces, but for a very long time now, the Europeans have not been on board materially with the way Washington has wanted them to be, with stepping up more support for some of the operations in the region. We know that not every European country in reality is supporting Operation Sentinel, which is a U.S. freedom of navigation operation in the Strait of Hormuz. The British are part of it, the Australians are part of it, but many countries are still not part of it. You had some countries weigh in on the killing of Soleimani, talking about his death. But I think all interested parties, particularly in Europe and Asia, would like to see a de-escalation. And that's why, again, all eyes are on Iran, which has this deep operational control of the proxy networks that Qasem Soleimani helped create or co-opt over 2 decades when he was at the helm of the Quds Force, and to see how they react. And news of more rocket attacks in Baghdad don't sound good to them.
Well, what is Iran's biggest challenge in 2020, and how will the country make up for the loss of General Soleimani?
Well, those are 2 very important questions, because bureaucratically, Soleimani's deputy, a brigadier general by the name of Ismail Qaani, was almost immediately promoted by Iran's supreme leader, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, to take over this position. And while he doesn't have the charisma of Soleimani, he will have the entire apparatus of Soleimani at his disposal. And this is an apparatus that Soleimani, again, has built over 2 decades and has yielded immense strategic and ideological dividends for Iran in places like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Bahrain, Afghanistan, you name it. So he will have an opportunity.
So when it comes to the U.S.'s maximum pressure campaign, where does it currently stand?
Well, again, the primary tool of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign is economic sanctions. You saw a reversion to that norm, a comfortability with using sanctions in President Trump's address today about the Iranian ballistic missile strikes on those 2 facilities in Iraq. So again, Washington is returning to what it's familiar with, non-kinetic, non-military tools of punishment, deterrence, and coercion. In 2020, the question is, now that the U.S. has taken out Soleimani, now that the U.S. has responded with military force and spilled blood of pro-Iran-backed Iraqi Shia militias in both Iraq and Syria after the killing of an American citizen and the first part of this maximum pressure campaign, how much will military force feature, even if they're one-off strikes, or to put Iran back into the box in terms of containment in 2020? And for that, again, the Iranians will have to respond to drive an American response.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu in Washington for us. Behnam, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more on Iran's future, let's bring in Charles Moreno. He is a former advisor to the Department of Homeland Security. Charles, thank you so much for being with us. Where do Iran and U.S. relations go from here?
Yeah. Good evening, Elaine. Thank you. We have a long way to go in terms of our relations with Iran. You know, the previous administration gave it a shot at diplomacy with the nuclear deal. This administration kind of shied away from that, withdrew from that, and focused more on the military instrument and certainly the economic through sanctions. So there's a lot of trust that needs to be restored here on part of Iran. This administration's been, I would say, very patient with some of the actions of Iran and their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. And I think following these attacks, we're going to have to sit back and they're going to have to demonstrate some good faith here towards the United States. And I've read earlier reports that, you know, Iran has relayed to the militia and to their terrorist proxies to kind of stand down and not hit U.S. assets in the Middle East or within the United States. And really, the proof is going to be in the pudding here, and we're going to have to sit back and watch.
So given the tensions, how likely or unlikely is it that Tehran and Washington actually come to the negotiating table?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how quickly or not diplomacy comes back on the scene. Like I said, Iran really has demonstrated some bad characteristics here recently with the attack on the embassy, the downings of the drone. I mean, we can go on and on about some of their past behaviors, which are very concerning. And I think the United States was quite frankly very patient with. So I think the burden here is on Iran. I think if they demonstrate some good faith and that this kind of stand down that's occurring right now is going to last and that their proxies understand Iran's intentions and desires, then maybe we can see diplomacy come back in the not so near future.
Well, what does this latest altercation do for regional security going forward?
Yeah. So the region is obviously on high alert here, not just based on Iran's behavior, but also through its militia and through Hamas and Hezbollah. Again, back to the behavior, back to how is everybody going to behave here? I think you have the two countries in Iran and the United States are certainly kind of at the same level right now. The problem is we're not just dealing with Iran. We're also dealing with their proxies. And that's really the unknown. This would not be the first time that their proxies went against their desires and took independent actions. One example I can think of, I certainly can guarantee that Hamas and Hezbollah do not seek Iran's authorization every time they decide to shoot a missile into Israel. So that's the type of situation that we're looking at here. And the other thing I would bring up too is that we can't assume that Hamas and Hezbollah and others in the region are quite frankly very happy with the tempered response that Iran set forth in their response last night, or the fact that this hasn't escalated with the United States. So there's really a lot of unknowns here.
Well, let's talk about Russia. What is Russia's take on what is going on? Does this create a power vacuum in Iraq and the rest of the Middle East that they can step into?
Yeah. Well, Iran, as we've seen in Iraq after Saddam Hussein was removed from power, Iran filled that void in a very large way in Iraq. So I think Russia in this situation, quite frankly, I would be very surprised if Russia was not playing a role here with Iran in trying to calm things down in the region. I believe that Russia knows what the United States is capable of. I think in this situation, if you look back towards the attack on the embassy, Iran may have overplayed their hand on this one. They got called on it by the United States. And I think Russia certainly probably advised Iran to take a step back, save face, launch some missiles. I do think that, launching 24 missiles, they certainly wanted to kill somebody, and they would have accepted the casualties if it happened, which would have led to a whole nother level of escalation with the United States. I think they're very lucky that nobody was killed and the early warning system worked and worked well. and nobody was killed. So I think Russia is probably playing, as an ally to Iran, playing their important role in kind of bringing this down to a simmer.
All right, Charles Marino. Charles, thank you.
Thank you.
And for the very latest on the Iran fallout, be sure to head to cbsnews.com/Iran. You can also get updates by downloading the free CBS News app. Coming up in our next hour, it's red and blue. It's been 3 weeks since the House voted to impeach President Trump. Why Senate Republicans now say they have the votes to start a trial. Plus, Facebook's policy chief was brought up to Capitol Hill to face questions on the efforts to crack down on deepfakes. More on what she told lawmakers. All that and more coming up next on Red and Blue.